He thought denying her would be routine. Just another face he could dismiss without consequence. But what he didn't realize was that in less than 10 minutes, the entire airport would remember her name. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The morning light poured through the towering glass walls of Gate 12 at LAX, reflecting off polished marble floors and designer luggage lined up in quiet rows. The kind of place where status spoke before words ever could. And Clara Bennett stepped into it like someone who didn't need to prove anything. Her soft gray cardigan slightly worn at the sleeves, her white sneakers clean but simple, her hair tied back in a low, effortless knot. Nothing about her appearance demanding attention, and yet everything about her presence felt deliberate, measured, calm, as if she had walked through far more important rooms than this one. But to the people watching, she was just another passenger who didn't quite belong in first class, and that assumption settled quickly in the air before she even reached the counter. The subtle glances, the faint smirks, the quiet exchange of looks that said more than words ever needed to. And behind the counter stood Ethan Cole, the gate manager, perfectly pressed. Uniform, sharp posture, the kind of man who believed he could read a person's worth in under 3 seconds. And as his eyes moved over Clara from head to toe, that silent judgment locked into place. Firm and unchallenged, he offered a tight, professional smile that never reached his eyes. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" His tone polite, but already edged with doubt. Clara handed it over without hesitation, her fingers steady, her gaze calm, and for a brief moment, the world held still as Ethan scanned the ticket, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly when he saw the words first class printed clearly across the top. But instead of correcting himself, instead of reconsidering, he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled while still carrying across the line of waiting passengers. "There must be some mistake," he said, handing it back with a subtle flick of his wrist. First-class check-in is reserved for confirmed premium passengers, and a few people nearby shifted, listening now, watching, sensing the tension that had just begun to build. Clara didn't move, didn't argue, didn't even blink at the implication behind his words. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, unreadable, and for a second, something in that silence unsettled him, but he pushed forward anyway, doubling down as if confidence could erase doubt. "If you'd like, I can direct you to the general boarding line," he added, gesturing toward the crowded section behind her where voices were louder, spaced tighter, where he clearly believed she belonged. A quiet ripple of amusement passed through a couple standing nearby, the kind of reaction that fed his certainty. That reassured him he was right, but Clara still said nothing. And that silence began to stretch, heavy now, deliberate, almost surgical in the way it cut through the moment. Her fingers lightly brushed against her phone, not rushed, not emotional, just precise, as if she had already decided exactly how this would unfold. And somewhere deep in that quiet, something shifted, unseen but inevitable, like the first crack in glass before it shatters. And Ethan, still holding onto his assumption, had no idea that he had just stepped into a situation he couldn't control, because the kind of people he dismissed the fastest were often the ones he understood the least. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the polished floor like something invisible yet undeniable. And Clara Bennett stood there as if time itself had slowed around her, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, while Ethan Cole shifted slightly behind the counter, adjusting his stance, his confidence still intact, but no longer as effortless as it had been seconds before, because there was something about her stillness that refused to match the role he had already assigned to her, and people nearby began to notice it too. The absence of embarrassment, the lack of urgency, the quiet refusal to comply, it unsettled the rhythm of the space. And in environments like this, where status was everything, disruption was rarely silent. It was usually loud, defensive, emotional. But Clara offered none of that. She simply looked at him, not with defiance, not with submission, but with a calm awareness that felt almost out of place. As if she had already seen the ending and was waiting for everyone else to catch up, Ethan cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step aside so we can assist other passengers." His voice slightly firmer now, carrying just enough authority to remind the line behind her who was in charge, and a man in a tailored navy suit behind. Clara sighed impatiently, checking his watch, while a woman beside him leaned closer and whispered something that ended with a quiet laugh, the kind that lingered just long enough to be heard. And still, Clara did not move. Instead, she slowly lifted her phone, her fingers steady as she typed a single message. No rush, no hesitation, just a brief pause as she read it once before pressing send. Then she lowered the phone back to her side, her gaze returning to Ethan, and that was when the atmosphere shifted again, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the air before a storm when something changes that no one can quite explain. Ethan frowned slightly, misreading the moment as stubbornness, as resistance he needed to shut down quickly. "If you do not move, I will have to call security," he said, louder now, enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly, and a few heads turned fully toward them. Attention sharpening, anticipation building, because moments like this always carried a certain kind of tension, a quiet curiosity about how far things would go. But Clara only nodded once, almost politely, as if acknowledging his words without accepting their weight, and that simple gesture made him hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, because it did not match the reaction he expected. There was no panic, no pleading, no attempt to explain herself, just calm acceptance. And that calm began to feel heavier than any argument could have been. Then came the sound, faint at first but distinct, the sharp echo of hurried footsteps against marble, fast, deliberate, approaching with urgency that did not belong to ordinary airport movement. Several people turned instinctively toward the direction of the sound, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence, and even Ethan's attention flickered for a moment, distracted, before he forced his focus back to Clara, unwilling to lose control of the situation he believed he still owned. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, unmistakable now, and within seconds, 3 men in tailored suits appeared at the far end of the gate, moving quickly, scanning faces with an intensity that immediately set them apart from everyone else in the terminal, their expressions tight, focused, not the relaxed confidence of travelers, but the urgency of people who were looking for someone important. And as they moved forward, parting the space around them without needing to ask, the entire energy of the gate shifted, conversation stopped, bodies straightened, attention redirected, and Clara, still standing exactly where she had been, lifted her eyes slightly, just enough to acknowledge their approach, as if she had been expecting them all along, while Ethan, now fully aware that something had changed beyond his control, felt the first real crack in his certainty, because whatever was about to happen next was no longer following his script. The moment the 3 men stepped fully into the light of Gate 12, the entire atmosphere shifted from casual impatience to something far more controlled, almost tense, like a room that suddenly realized it had misjudged its own importance. And they did not slow down, not for the line, not for the murmurs, not even for Ethan standing rigid behind the counter, because their focus was fixed on one person, and one person only, Clara Bennett, who remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if none of this surprised her in the slightest. And as the men approached, their polished shoes striking the marble floor in sharp, rhythmic echoes, conversations around them died completely, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on every observer. And Ethan felt it now, unmistakably, the shift he could not explain, the kind that did not come from authority but from recognition, the kind that meant he was no longer in control. The first man, tall, composed, his navy suit perfectly tailored, reached Clara first, stopping just short of her with a breath he had clearly been holding. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice steady but edged with urgency, and the way he said her name, not loudly, not dramatically, but with unmistakable respect, cut through the space like a quiet command, and the other 2 men fell in just behind him, their attention fixed, their posture straight, as if they were standing in front of someone whose presence required immediate acknowledgement. And Clara simply inclined her head slightly, not as someone being recognized, but as someone confirming what she already knew. And in that small movement, the entire dynamic of the room began to collapse. Ethan blinked, his mind racing to process what he was seeing, because nothing about this aligned with the conclusion he had made just moments ago. Nothing about her simple clothing, her quiet demeanor, her lack of reaction had prepared him for this. And yet here it was, undeniable, unfolding right in front of him. The man in the navy suit turned slightly, his gaze shifting from Clara to the counter, to Ethan, and the change in his expression was immediate, polite professionalism replaced by something colder, more precise. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, and the question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. It carried expectation, accountability, the kind that did not need to be explained. Ethan straightened instinctively, his voice catching for just a fraction of a second before he forced it steady. "No, sir, just a routine verification issue," he said, choosing his words carefully now, aware that the situation had moved beyond his understanding, but still trying to hold on to the authority he had claimed earlier. But the second man stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to show that he had already reached a conclusion of his own. "Routine?" he repeated, his tone calm but unmistakably firm, and behind them, the line of passengers stood frozen, watching, the earlier smirks gone, replaced by quiet uncertainty, because the scene no longer made sense in the way it had before. Clara's presence, once dismissed, now anchored the entire space, and she had not raised her voice, had not defended herself, had not needed to, and that was what made the moment heavier than anything else, because everything unfolding now was not coming from reaction, it was coming from recognition, and recognition, once revealed, could not be undone. Ethan's grip on the counter tightened slightly, the realization beginning to settle in, slow and unavoidable, like a door closing behind him. And then the third man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward just enough to stand beside the others, his voice quieter than the rest, but carrying with it a finality that left no room for interpretation. "She has a flight to catch," he said, his eyes fixed directly on Ethan. And in that single sentence, something shifted completely, because it was no longer about a boarding pass, or a seat, or a policy. It was about position, about understanding who stood where. And as Clara lifted her gaze once more, meeting Ethan's eyes for the first time since the moment began, there was no anger there, no triumph, just clarity, and that clarity was enough to make everything else in the room fall silent. Because in that instant, everyone understood the same thing. The person they had overlooked was the one they should have recognized first. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it, not because of what had been said, but because of what no one could deny anymore. And Ethan Cole stood there with the faint realization settling in piece by piece, his authority slipping not with noise or confrontation, but with the quiet certainty that he had misjudged something far beyond correction, his eyes flicking from Clara to the three men beside her, searching for some explanation that would restore the balance he had so confidently controlled just minutes ago. But there was none, only the undeniable shift in how the room now saw her, how the space itself seemed to adjust around her presence. And the man in the navy suit took a small step closer to the counter, his posture straight, his tone measured but firm. "We need to understand exactly what happened here," he said, not loudly, but with a precision that left no room for dismissal. And Ethan swallowed, forcing his voice into something resembling professionalism. "It was a misunderstanding, sir, just a verification issue regarding her ticket," he replied, though even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, weaker, like something already unraveling, because the moment he said her ticket, the second executive let out a quiet breath, almost incredulous, shaking his head slightly, as if the explanation itself had missed the point entirely. "Her ticket is not the issue," he said, his eyes narrowing just enough to make the distinction clear. And behind them, the crowd remained completely still, no longer whispering, no longer reacting, just watching, absorbing, because the narrative they had silently accepted earlier was now collapsing in real time. And Clara, who had not moved from her place, finally shifted her weight slightly, not in discomfort, but in quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its turning point. She looked at Ethan again, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm clarity that made everything else feel smaller, less important. And that was when the third executive spoke again, his voice steady, deliberate. "You denied her access to a seat she was already entitled to," he said, each word landing with quiet finality. "And you did it publicly." And the way he emphasized that last word caused something in the room to tighten, because everyone there had witnessed it, had been part of it in one way or another, and Ethan felt that weight now, not just from the men in front of him, but from the silence behind him, the realization that this was no longer a private interaction. It was a moment that had been seen, judged, and now understood differently. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as easily as before, because for the first time, he was not speaking from authority, he was reacting to it. And Clara finally spoke, her voice soft, steady, carrying without effort. "You did your job based on what you saw," she said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to confuse him for a moment, because it was not an accusation, not an attack, just a statement of fact. But then she added, just as calmly, "The problem is you decided what I was worth before you checked what was true." And the words landed differently than anything else had, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like something that could not be argued against. And the man in the navy suit gave a small nod, as if that was the only explanation that mattered. "Ms. Bennett is not just a passenger," he said, turning his attention fully to Ethan now. "She is the reason this division exists at all." And the air seemed to shift again, heavier this time, more final, because that sentence did not just reveal her position, it redefined everything that had happened before it. The line, the smirks, the dismissal, all of it reframed in an instant, and Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that the realization had fully arrived, the understanding that this was not a situation he could correct with an apology or a quick adjustment. This was something that had already exposed a deeper truth, and Clara did not step forward, did not demand anything. She simply held his gaze for a brief moment longer before looking away, as if the outcome no longer needed her attention, because some lessons did not require punishment, only recognition. And as the silence settled once more over Gate 12, it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of clarity, the kind that leaves nothing left to misunderstand. No one moved, not immediately, because moments like this did not end with noise, they ended with understanding. And the understanding settling over Gate 12 was heavier than anything that had been said. Ethan Cole stood behind the counter, his posture still upright, his uniform still sharp, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something quieter, deeper. The realization that the authority he relied on had not failed him, it had revealed him, and the difference between those two things was not something he could ignore. The three executives remained composed, their presence no longer urgent but controlled, as if the situation had already reached its conclusion long before anyone else realized it. And Clara Bennett, still calm, still steady, glanced briefly toward the boarding gate where the first-class passengers had begun to line up again, the routine of the airport slowly trying to resume. But it did not quite return to normal, not yet, because everyone who had witnessed the moment was still holding on to it, still processing what they had just seen. The man in the navy suit spoke again, his voice even. "We will handle this internally," he said, not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a statement of responsibility, and that distinction made it clear that this was not about one mistake. It was about something larger, something systemic, something that extended beyond a single interaction. Ethan nodded slowly, the confidence that had once guided his every word now replaced with careful awareness. "I understand," he said, and for the first time since the interaction began, his voice carried something different, not authority, not defensiveness, but acknowledgement. And Clara turned slightly toward him, not stepping closer, not creating distance, just enough to meet him where he stood, her expression unchanged, her tone quiet. "This was not about a seat," she said, and the simplicity of her words made them land harder, because everyone there knew it was true. "It was about how quickly you decided who belonged." And again, there was no anger in her voice, no need to escalate, because the truth itself was enough. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not out of submission, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when someone sees their own actions clearly for the first time. And in that moment, The crowd that had once judged her began to shift as well. The man in the navy suit behind her straightened his jacket, no longer impatient. The woman who had laughed earlier now silent. Her expression tightened with quiet discomfort, because the judgment they had shared had not belonged only to Ethan. It had existed in the room, unspoken but present, and now it had been exposed. Clara glanced once more at her phone, then toward the gate, as if recalibrating her own timeline, unaffected by the weight of what had just unfolded. And one of the executives stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the first-class entrance. "Your seat is ready," he said, his tone respectful, measured, but Clara did not move immediately. Instead, she paused for just a second longer, her eyes scanning the space, not searching for approval, not looking for reaction, but acknowledging the moment as a whole, as if understanding that what had happened here would not end when she walked away. It would stay in the minds of everyone who had seen it. And that was when she spoke one final time, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest. "Respect is not something you offer based on appearance," she said, her gaze briefly meeting Ethan's again. "It is something you practice, especially when no one is watching." And then, without waiting for a response, without needing one, she turned and walked toward the gate, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged. And as she passed through the first-class entrance, the space behind her remained still, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. And in that silence, the lesson settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the kind that does not demand attention, only reflection, because sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that explode, but the ones that quietly reshape how people see the world. The hum of the aircraft cabin wrapped softly around Clara Bennett as she stepped into first class, the quiet contrast to the tension she had just left behind settling almost instantly. The soft leather seats, the low ambient lighting, the measured voices of flight attendants greeting passengers with polished smiles. Everything here moved with a calm precision that felt expected, familiar. And yet what lingered was not the comfort of the seat waiting for her. It was the silence she had left behind at Gate 12, the kind that does not fade when you walk away, but follows, reshaping the space long after you are gone. She placed her small carry-on neatly in the overhead compartment, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if nothing about the last 10 minutes had been unusual, as if moments like that were not disruptions, but confirmations of something she had understood for a long time. And as she lowered herself into the seat by the window, her gaze drifting briefly toward the runway. Beyond the glass, the world outside moving in steady, predictable patterns, she allowed herself a single quiet breath, not of relief, but of acknowledgement, because what had happened was not new, not surprising, only different in how clearly it had revealed itself. A flight attendant approached, her posture attentive, her tone respectful in a way that carried awareness now. "Ms. Bennett, can I offer you something before takeoff?" she asked, and Clara gave a small nod, her voice calm. "Water, please. Nothing more, nothing less." And the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than the elaborate politeness that often filled spaces like this, because respect, once real, did not need to be exaggerated. It simply existed. And as the attendant stepped away, Clara's phone buzzed softly in her hand, a message from Daniel Brooks appearing on the screen. "We are reviewing everything immediately. This will not happen again." The words direct, efficient, but behind them was something deeper, not just a promise of correction, but an acknowledgement of failure. And Clara read it once before locking the screen, not replying, because she did not need to. The situation had already spoken for itself. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit glanced at her briefly, then quickly looked away, as if unsure how to place her now. And that uncertainty lingered, because people are often more comfortable with clear categories, with labels that allow them to decide quickly who belongs and who does not. But Clara had never fit into those categories, and she had never tried to. The overhead announcement chimed softly, signaling boarding completion, the cabin doors preparing to close, and in that moment, the aircraft became its own contained world, separate from the one outside. But the impact of what had happened did not stay behind, because at Gate 12, Ethan Cole remained standing exactly where she had left him, The rhythm of the airport slowly returning around him, passengers moving, conversations resuming, but something fundamental had shifted, not in the system, not in the procedures, but in him, the clarity of the moment replaying in his mind with uncomfortable precision. Not the arrival of the executives, not even the revelation of her position, but the quiet way she had spoken. The absence of anger, the absence of resistance, the way she had allowed him to reveal himself without interruption. And that realization settled deeper than any reprimand could have, because it was not imposed, it was understood. And as he looked out toward the boarding gate now empty, he recognized something he had overlooked before, that authority without awareness is fragile, that judgment without verification is dangerous, and that respect is not a reaction to status, it is a standard you either uphold or you do not. And back inside the aircraft, Clara closed her eyes briefly as the engines began their low, steady build, the sound rising like a quiet promise of forward motion, not just for the journey ahead, but for something less visible, something that does not announce itself, but changes people nonetheless. And as the plane began to move, there was no applause, no dramatic closure, just a quiet understanding carried forward, the kind that does not need to be spoken again. Because once it is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the runway, the city below shrinking into a pattern of lights and motion that no longer held Clara Bennett's attention, because her focus had already moved beyond the moment that had just passed, not in dismissal, but in quiet reflection, the kind that does not replay events for validation, but for understanding. And as the seatbelt sign remained illuminated and the cabin settled into a calm, steady hum, she opened her eyes and glanced briefly at the passengers around her, each one absorbed in their own world, their own assumptions, their own silent judgments that would never be spoken aloud. And that was the nature of it, she thought. Not the obvious moments of disrespect, but the invisible ones, the ones that happen in seconds, in glances, in decisions made before a single word is exchanged. And those were the moments that shaped everything, because they revealed who people believed others were, before they ever asked who they truly might be. And across the aisle, the same man who had avoided eye contact earlier now shifted again, his posture slightly more careful, as if the uncertainty he felt had not left him, only deepened. And Clara did not acknowledge it, not because she had not noticed, but because she understood that recognition, real recognition, does not come from being seen in a single moment. It comes from being understood over time. And that was not something she needed to force. The flight attendant returned quietly, placing a glass of water on the tray beside her, her tone softer now, more aware. "If you need anything at all, please let me know," she said, and Clara gave a small nod. "Thank you." Nothing more, no emphasis, no expectation, because respect, once genuine, did not require reinforcement. It simply existed in the way people carried themselves, in the way they chose to see others. And as the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime, signaling that the journey had moved into its next phase. And back on the ground, far below, Gate 12 had returned to its routine, new passengers filling the space, new interactions unfolding. But for Ethan Cole, nothing felt the same, because while the environment had reset, his perspective had not. He stood in the same place, performing the same tasks, greeting the same types of travelers, but now each glance carried weight. Each decision paused for just a fraction longer than before, because the clarity he had gained could not be undone. And that clarity was not about Clara's title, not about her position, not even about the consequences that might follow. It was about the moment before all of that, the moment when he had decided who she was without knowing anything at all. And as another passenger approached the counter, dressed casually, holding a ticket that might have once triggered the same automatic judgment, Ethan hesitated, just for a second, and in that second, something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. He looked at the ticket, then at the person, and this time, he did not assume. He asked, his tone measured, his posture adjusted, and the difference was subtle, but real, because growth does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, in the decisions no one notices, in the corrections that are made without recognition. And that was the lesson Clara had left behind, not spoken as a command, not enforced as a rule, but demonstrated as a truth. And as the aircraft continued its steady path across the sky, carrying her toward whatever came next, the impact of her presence remained behind, not in the form of memory alone, but in the quiet shift of perspective that would shape moments long after she was gone. Because sometimes the most powerful influence is not in what you say, but in what you reveal, and once revealed, it changes everything that comes after. The aircraft moved steadily through the clouds, the soft glow of cabin lights reflecting against polished surfaces, and Clara Bennett sat quietly by the window, her gaze resting on the endless horizon where sky met sky, a place without labels, without hierarchy, without the invisible lines people so often draw between one another. And in that stillness, there was clarity, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. Because moments like the one at Gate 12 were never isolated, they were reflections of something larger, something deeply rooted in how people see, how they decide, how quickly they form conclusions based on fragments instead of truth. And Clara had seen it before, in different places, different forms, but always the same pattern: the quiet dismissal, the subtle separation, the unspoken belief that worth could be measured at a glance. And yet, every time it happened, it revealed more about the one judging than the one being judged. And across the cabin, a young flight attendant paused briefly near the galley, watching Clara from a distance, not with curiosity, but with a kind of thoughtful awareness, as if she too had witnessed something earlier that had shifted her understanding. And that was how change often began, not with loud declarations, but with quiet observations that stayed, that lingered, that slowly reshaped how someone moved through the world. And back on the ground, Ethan Cole finished assisting another passenger, his tone measured, his posture composed. But now there was intention behind it, a deliberate awareness in how he spoke, how he listened, how he chose his words. Because once you have seen the consequences of assumption, you cannot return to ignorance. And as the flow of travelers continued, each interaction became an opportunity, not to perform authority, but to practice respect, something far more difficult, far more demanding, because it required consistency, not convenience. And nearby, one of his colleagues glanced at him, noticing the difference, the pause before he spoke, the way he no longer rushed to conclusions. And though nothing was said, the change was visible, subtle but undeniable, because transformation does not announce itself. It reveals itself through action, through the choices made when no one is paying attention. And that was the quiet impact Clara had left behind. Not a scene, not a confrontation, but a shift, something that would ripple outward in ways she would never see. And as the aircraft continued its journey, Clara reached for her phone once more, not to respond, not to revisit the moment, but to move forward, her focus already on what lay ahead. Because she had never needed validation from moments like that, she understood her place long before anyone else recognized it. And that understanding gave her something far more powerful than authority. It gave her steadiness, the kind that does not change based on how others perceive you. And as she set her phone down and looked out once more at the vast, open sky, there was a quiet certainty in her expression, not pride, not satisfaction, but something deeper, something grounded. Because the truth is, the world will always try to place people into categories, to define them quickly, to understand them easily. But those who truly understand their own worth do not need to fit into those definitions. They move beyond them, calmly, consistently. And in doing so, they reveal something far more important, not just who they are, but how others choose to see. And that choice, more than anything else, is what shapes the world we all move through. One moment, one interaction, one decision at a time. The aircraft began its gradual descent, the faint shift in engine tone signaling that the journey was nearing its end. And Clara Bennett remained still by the window, her gaze steady as the clouds parted beneath them, revealing the city below, structured, organized, yet filled with the same unseen patterns she had witnessed time and time again, patterns of judgment, assumption, and quiet correction. And as the cabin lights brightened slightly, passengers around her stirred, gathering their belongings, preparing to step back into a world that would once again ask them to decide quickly who people were, often before understanding anything at all. And Clara did not rush. She never did, because she had long understood that presence is not measured by speed, but by awareness. And across the aisle, the same man who had once looked away now hesitated before speaking. "Excuse me," he said, his tone careful, almost uncertain. "I just wanted to say, I think I misjudged you earlier." And Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity she had carried from the beginning. "It happens," she replied softly, not dismissing him, not correcting him, simply acknowledging the truth of it. Because the lesson was not in the apology, it was in the recognition. And as the plane touched down with a smooth, controlled landing, a quiet ripple of motion moved through the cabin, seatbelts unfastening, overhead bins opening, conversations resuming, the ordinary rhythm of travel returning. But something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, in the way at least a few people now understood the moments they would encounter next. And far behind them, at Gate 12, the day continued. New faces, new interactions, but the space carried a memory, not of conflict, but of clarity, the kind that does not fade easily. Because it was not tied to emotion, it was tied to truth. And Ethan Cole stood there once more, greeting passengers, scanning tickets. But now there was something different in the way he looked at people, not searching for status, not relying on appearance, but taking that extra moment, that small but significant pause before deciding. And that pause changed everything. Because in that pause, there was room for respect, for fairness, for something deeper than assumption. And that was the quiet impact Clara had left behind, not as a lesson imposed, but as one revealed. And as Clara stepped off the aircraft, walking into the terminal with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning, there was no need for recognition, no need for acknowledgement. Because the moment had never been about proving who she was. It had been about revealing how others chose to see. And in doing so, it had reshaped something far more important than a single interaction. It had shifted perspective, and that shift would continue long after she was gone, carried forward in small decisions, in brief hesitations, in the choice to look again instead of assuming. Because respect is not something reserved for certain people. It is something that defines all people. And the moment you forget that, you reveal more about yourself than you ever intended. The terminal doors opened ahead of her, light pouring in, movement continuing, the world unchanged on the surface, but altered in the ways that truly matter. And somewhere behind her, in a place she would never return to, a quiet understanding remained, steady, permanent, and impossible to ignore. Because once dignity is revealed, it cannot be unseen. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.